The day we signed our prenup, my fiancé spoke fluent Spanish to the lawyers, language he never once used with me in 2 years of dating. I didn't blink. I didn't let them know I understood every word. But from that moment on, I stopped preparing for a wedding. I started preparing to bury the version of myself who trusted him. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Absolute Revenge. Your support gives us encouragement to make more stories like these. Thank you. Julian always paid for valet, even at places that had parking, the kind of man who folded napkins into his lap before sipping water, who knew the difference between mineral and spring, but never asked me about the language I grew up hearing. Never once noticed how my eyes tracked Spanish on TV menus or how I laughed before the subtitles caught up. That morning, his shirt was navy, pressed like it still remembered its plastic wrap, and his voice, easy low, was smoother than the lawyer's wood-paneled office. We were signing something big, but he made it feel like brunch, like air. 2 copies, his lawyer said, handing mine to me like a server with a check. Once you both sign, we'll scan and have you out in 15. I nodded politely, pen already in hand, when Julian leaned over the desk toward the attorney and said, calmly, like he'd said it 100 times, has lo que te dije con los papeles. Just like that. Clear. Commanding. No hesitation. And I didn't flinch. I didn't breathe. I watched their eyes flicker toward me and then away, assuming I hadn't understood, assuming I was just a woman with good posture and a quiet mouth, someone raised far from Havana kitchens and whispered curses. Mine smiled at me, my lawyer, the one I picked because her website had pastel fonts and testimonials from yoga instructors. She smiled like everything was normal, and I smiled right back, like I hadn't just heard the room tilt on its axis. Initial here, Isla, and we're all set, she said, pointing to a clause about inheritance, the paragraph neatly folded in legal jargon about fair distribution and non-interference. I nodded, humming something like agreement, even as the air shifted behind my teeth. Julian didn't glance at me. He was texting someone under the table, his thumb a metronome of secrecy. We'd had dozens of dates, slow dinners, long walks, weekend getaways to places with vineyards and tile floors. And he never once mentioned speaking Spanish. Never once asked if I did. It didn't slip accidentally, not once, not during traffic, sex, or tequila. That wasn't coincidence. That was curation. A man doesn't hide his tongue unless it's saying something he doesn't want heard. And still I signed. I initialed. I handed over my document with a smile like a secret. He kissed the top of my hand afterward, like we were in some old European film, and said, "You're incredible, Isla." Seriously. In the elevator, I kept quiet, my throat warm with questions I'd already answered. Julian was humming softly, checking his watch, distracted by something small and digital, unaware that I had seen the entire play unfold from behind a two-way mirror. "Drinks at Altaya?" he asked, tapping his driver. I nodded again, pretending my heart wasn't rehearsing its exit strategy. When we stepped out into sunlight, his hand grazed the small of my back, firm, casual, the way a man touches something he believes he owns. I almost laughed. I think part of me did. Quietly. Inwardly. At the bar, he ordered me a drink I didn't want, said for the bride-to-be loud enough for the bartender to smile at me like I was lucky. "It's real now," Julian said, toasting the air between us. One step closer to forever. I clinked his glass with mine and studied his eyes over the rim. No flicker. No remorse. Just a man confident in the script he'd written, forgetting his audience was raised by women who taught their daughters to read between gestures. I sipped slowly, nodded at the right places, waited for the room to dim just slightly. He told me we'd do the wedding in Valencia, mentioned a villa, how his family had ties there, how I'd love the food. And for the first time I asked, "Did you grow up speaking Spanish?" His face paused, just for a moment. Oh, a bit. My grandmother. "Why?" he said, reaching for a breadstick. I shrugged. "You just don't strike me as the type who forgets to mention things." He laughed. "You're cute when you're suspicious." And I smiled again. I had to. Because suspicion wasn't the right word. What I felt was colder. Older. Like knowing the storm's already overhead. We ended the night with him wrapped around me, half asleep, whispering about rings and venues and a future he thought he controlled. But my eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, remembering every word he'd said when he thought I couldn't understand. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel panic. I felt something better. I felt ready. Because when a man writes a script and forgets the girl was raised to read subtext, he's not planning a wedding. He's building a stage. And I was already rewriting the ending, scene by scene, breath by breath. The first thing I did was call Eva. She's the one person who has never asked me to explain myself, never forced me to translate my silences into neat sentences. She answered on the second ring with, "Tell me everything," and I did, pausing only when my throat caught on that phrase, "has lo kt dij con los papels." She didn't say much, just listened, the way real friends do, then asked for a photo of the documents. I took the pages into the bathroom, angled the light, and sent the scans while Julian snored softly in the next room. By morning, she'd circled 3 clauses. One was standard. The second had language that could have gone either way, but the third, the one tucked into a subsection under dispute protocol, was surgical. If either party initiated a public accusation or sought a legal amendment within the first 18 months, all assets reverted to the original owner, and claims to marital equity became void. "Isla," she said, voice low, "that clause doesn't protect you, it binds you. It's not a prenup. It's a silencing agreement." I stared at the email while Julian laid out my breakfast, sunny side up, toast cut diagonally. He kissed my temple like he hadn't spent weeks engineering something he never intended me to read. "You good?" he asked, sliding the plate toward me, hand still warm from the mug he'd poured. I nodded, chewing mechanically, feeling the yolk catch in my throat. "You didn't say you spoke Spanish," I said, pretending it was casual. He paused for a beat too short to be guilt, too long to be honest. "Oh yeah, just a little. Picked it up in boarding school," he said, then smiled like it was trivia, like it didn't mean anything at all. Eva met me for coffee that afternoon, in a small place where no one knew my name. She handed me a printout of the clause, annotated, dissected, translated twice. "This is intentional," she said, her finger tracing the line. "It's built to look harmless, but it's like a tripwire. The minute you push back, it detonates everything. Your options, your leverage." I stared at the ink, the elegance of the trap. "You think he's done this before?" I asked quietly. "I think he's had help," she replied. "Lawyers don't draft clauses like this unless someone tells them what to protect." Later that night, I sat across from Julian on the couch, both of us in sweatpants, watching something with subtitles neither of us were reading. "When did you last talk to your ex?" I asked, still looking at the screen. He tilted his head, confused. "Which one?" he said with a half smile. I shrugged, taking a sip of wine. "Any of them. You never really talk about that part of your life." He paused, then said, "There's not much to say. I've dated, but I was never really serious until you." And I watched him lie like it was kindness. 2 days later, I found her. Her name was Lucia. The only trace of her was an archived photography blog and a defunct LinkedIn. But her email still worked, and when I wrote her, she replied in one line. "Do you know about the Marbella incident? We met in a small bookstore just off Santa Monica. She wore her hair up, no makeup, a woman used to hiding in plain sight. He gets you to fall in love with a version of yourself you think you've never met," she said. "Then he signs your future away while calling it love." She handed me a flash drive, said, "This is everything I could gather before I left. Financials, statements, screenshots, emails." I thought I was the last. "I'm sorry you weren't." I wanted to ask her why she never went public, but I already knew. Men like Julian don't just manipulate, they structure it. They bury their cruelty in paperwork, in politeness, in ambiguity that looks generous. "He's careful," she said, "but not perfect. He always makes the same mistake." "Which is?" I asked. She smiled, sad and knowing. "He always thinks the woman he's hurting doesn't understand the game." I walked home that evening in silence, flash drive heavy in my coat pocket, Julian's voice echoing in my voicemail asking if I wanted sushi or Italian. The sky was the color of ash, the kind of dusk that makes you feel like you're walking through memory. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel fear. I felt detail. Texture. The grain of a lie pressed into silk sheets. And when I stepped through the door, Julian was already in the kitchen, apron on, playlist humming. "Hey babe," he called out, "you'll never guess who I ran into today." I didn't blink. Julian was chopping scallions when I walked in, the kitchen filled with ginger and garlic and some jazz playlist I'd never heard before. "I ran into Jason," he said, tossing the knife down like punctuation. "He wants to meet for golf this weekend, said to bring you along." I set my bag down slowly, watching him move, like always deliberate, practiced. "You ever mention me to him?" I asked, and Julian laughed, wiping his hands. "Of course, I tell him you keep me sane." I nodded, pouring myself water, his words already twisting around everything I now knew. He asked about my day while stirring noodles, eyes soft, voice even. I told him I'd run errands, mailed a package, took a walk near Echo Park, small details that made everything sound normal. He didn't know I'd met with a paralegal who moonlighted as a whistleblower, didn't see the envelope in my tote. Lucia's files, neatly printed, chronologically ordered. "You okay?" he asked, tilting his head, his tone honeyed. "You're quiet." I smiled at him gently, lifting the corners of my mouth just enough. "I'm good. Just tired," I said, and he believed me because he always believed the version he created. Later that night, while he showered, I opened the envelope under the light of my desk lamp. It was all there. His asset transfers, emails between him and the lawyer, a dated list of past engagements, 3 women before me, one in the Cayman Islands, another in Marseille. All gone, all settled privately, all silenced by the very clause I had just signed. Lucia's note at the top read, "He doesn't marry, he binds." The room was so still I could hear the pulse in my neck, and beneath the legal terms, I saw it all strategy disguised as sentiment. The next morning, I told him I wanted to host a dinner, said I missed his sister, that we should get the families together before things got too hectic. "You sure?" he asked, looking up from his emails. "I thought you didn't like hosting." I shrugged. "I think I want to start doing more things that scare me," and he smiled like he'd converted me, like this was what love did, reshape you. I texted Eva as soon as he left for work. "Get me everything you can on Smith and Cordell LLP, I typed. "I want to know how deep this goes." That afternoon, I walked into a jewelry store, asked to see their custom bands, told them I'd be needing a rush order. The woman behind the counter smiled, asked about my partner, and I said, "He's detail-oriented," because saying predatory wouldn't have fit the lighting. "We have clients like that," she said with a wink. I picked the plainest ring they had, gold, thin, unremarkable, something that wouldn't compete with the truth. It would buy me time. People trust brides who lean into tradition. They don't expect women with veils to be building quiet escape routes while tasting cake samples. That night, Julian noticed. "You seem lighter," he said, tracing my wrist while we lay in bed, less tense. I turned toward him, ran a hand along his chest like I still believed he was my future. "I think I'm just grateful," I whispered. "For what?" he asked, and I paused just long enough to make him lean in. "For knowing what I want," I said. He kissed me like I was everything, like I was someone to keep. I held him like he was something already gone. And when he slept, I stayed awake counting all the ways I could leave. The dinner was set for the following Saturday. I planned the seating chart carefully. His sister next to mine, his accountant across from my godfather, my ex-roommate from grad school beside his oldest friend. Julian didn't ask why I invited who I did, just said, "You've got good instincts for people," and I bit my tongue. I wore red that night, not bridal, just bold. And every conversation I had began with kindness and ended with a question. "How long have you known Julian? Did he ever talk about his last fiancé? You've worked with him how long?" It all slipped out easily. At the end of the night, while he poured dessert wine and kissed my hand in front of everyone, I looked at the room he thought was his kingdom and saw it, each guest now holding a different version of Julian than the one they came with. Each one slightly more awake. And maybe they didn't know exactly what was wrong, but they felt something shift, some truth begin to unravel. He couldn't feel it yet, but it was coming, already breathing through the cracks. I kissed his cheek, laughed at something he said, and thanked them all for coming. The day before we flew to Valencia, Julian called his lawyer twice. I watched from the doorway, half-packed suitcase behind me, his voice lowered, steady, ending each call with "just make sure it's clean." He told me it was about venue insurance, said it casually, like I wouldn't remember how he spoke when he forgot to perform. I folded my jeans slower than necessary, asked if he needed help with his packing, and he smiled, distracted, waving me off. "You've got your hands full with all the beauty prep," he said, like my role was clear, and I let him. Valencia was golden, warm in a way that made even Betrayal look romantic. We stayed in a rented villa just off the coast, marble floors, olive trees in the yard, wine delivered at 4 p.m. sharp. His family arrived the next morning, all sharp smiles and soft jabs. His mother said I had refined hips and asked if my family had any European lineage. I said, mostly honesty, and she blinked like I'd spoken in code. Julian laughed, steered me away, whispered, "She's just old-fashioned," and I nodded, biting back every reply I had stored for women like her. The rehearsal dinner was small, just 20 guests, soft lighting, too much wine. Julian made a toast that used the word destiny twice, and I laughed into my glass because even the lie sounded expensive. His sister clinked hers against mine later and said, "You're braver than the last one," and I smiled, held her gaze, asked softly, "What happened to her?" She blinked. She just left. Couldn't keep up with him. I nodded again, the quiet between us heavier than the wine. She didn't say more, but her hand brushed mine before she turned away, like she already knew. The morning of the ceremony, I asked Julian if we could do something non-traditional, something just for us before the guests arrived. Like a blessing, I said, watching his eyes for flicker. "We could have someone do it in Spanish, your grandmother's language." He hesitated, and I watched him weigh it, then smile, slow and assured. "That's actually sweet," he said. "I'll make a call." And, just like that, he opened the door. My notary arrived that afternoon, dressed as a celebrant, documents tucked inside an old Bible, voice clear and slow. No one questioned it. It was a private moment. He stood beside me under the olive branches, hand warm in mine, and when the notary read the passage in Spanish, subtle, firm, buried in the rhythm of a prayer, I said yes, clearly, deliberately. Julian said yes too, not knowing that what he agreed to wasn't symbolic. It was legal. It dissolved the previous agreement, rewrote the terms, freed me from every thread he'd tried to knot around me. He smiled at me when it was over, kissed my cheek, whispered, "You're full of surprises," and I said, "So are you," then turned to greet the next arriving guest. That night, in our suite, I let him touch me like he still believed I was his. Let him trace plans onto my skin with the same hands that tried to bind mine with ink. "It's all starting," he whispered, breath warm against my collarbone. "You ready?" And I said yes again, but softer this time, more like a question. I didn't sleep. I watched the moon shift across the stone tiles, listened to the wind, imagined the clause being overwritten in slow, legal Spanish, line by line, my voice sealing it. The air smelled like citrus and quiet power. The next morning, I told him I needed to visit the cathedral, said it was tradition to light a candle for the women who came before you. He nodded, said he'd meet me after his call with the planners. I walked instead to a small cafe near the coast, opened my laptop, uploaded the documents, then deleted the drive. Eva messaged me 5 minutes later, "Clean. Confirmed. It's yours now." I sat there, sipping bitter coffee, wondering how long he'd stay standing in a ceremony that was already dissolving beneath him. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like exhaling. By the time we flew home, he was relaxed, talking about the honeymoon, asking what color I wanted the walls in our new house. I listened, nodding at the right places, watching the outline of a man slowly losing shape. He had no idea the contract had been rewritten. No idea the foundation he stood on had been lifted and replaced. He just kept talking, smiling, reaching for my hand. And I let him, gently, steadily, waiting for the moment when he'd realize that I'd heard every word. Not just in Spanish. In silence. In omission. In structure. In intent. 3 weeks after we got back, Julian invited a few colleagues over, the kind who wore watches that weighed more than their sincerity. He poured them scotch, called me his brilliant wife, Told a story about our wedding like it was a Netflix special, polished and crowd-friendly. I laughed at the right moments, passed around charcuterie, nodded through their compliments. They asked about the prenup, smart move, man, and he winked, said, just making sure everyone's protected. I excused myself before I answered. In the kitchen, I stood by the sink and stared at my reflection, letting the silence fill the room. The next morning, I found a receipt in his coat pocket. It was from a jeweler in Milan, dated 2 days before the wedding, the purchase discreet, not hidden, just placed where I wasn't meant to look. He said it was a gift for his mother, some family heirloom replacement. I tilted my head, asked what stone it was, and he blinked once, twice, said emerald, when the receipt clearly said sapphire. I didn't correct him. I folded the paper, tucked it into a book on property law, and changed the subject to dinner plans. He followed, as always. When I called Eva, I didn't cry, didn't explain. I just said, let's talk about dissolution timelines, and she knew. She asked if I wanted public or private, asked if I needed safe housing or digital erasure, and I said, just precision. The documents took 4 days. The notary was the same one who'd undone the first clause, now tasked with finalizing what Julian never saw coming. I signed quietly at my desk, sunlight spilling through the curtains, the pen warm in my hand, like closure. No ceremony. No announcements. Just clean exits, line by line, in ink that didn't bleed. Julian found the envelope 2 nights later. He walked into the living room holding it like it was a mistake, like I'd left my passport in the mailbox. What is this? He asked, voice flat, controlled. I looked up from my book and said, you've read contracts. You tell me. He didn't sit down. He scanned the signature page twice, then looked at me with something close to fear, but dressed up in confusion. You signed this? He asked. You filed this? I nodded. Last week. He didn't shout. He just stood there, quietly unraveling, and for the first time, didn't speak. He asked if there was someone else. I almost laughed. Julian, I married you knowing what you were, I said, and I still stayed long enough for you to undo yourself. He leaned against the counter, suddenly unsure of where to place his hands. You're doing this over what? Some clause. I met his eyes. Over everything that clause represented. He shook his head, like he couldn't translate the sentence. I gave you everything. You gave me paperwork, I said, calmly. I gave you silence. For a while. He didn't respond. Just turned and walked out of the room. The divorce was processed in 17 days. Clean, mutual, legally indisputable. My accounts untouched. My name unscarred. His lawyer called once to confirm I wouldn't be seeking damages, and Eva answered for me. Her dignity is paid in full, she said. There were no headlines, no parties, no angry messages. Just a quiet recalibration of truth. His mother sent me a thank you note, handwritten, telling me she hoped I'd find someone more traditional. I framed it. Hung it next to the contract Julian thought he'd built to protect himself. Not out of pride, just as a reminder of what silence knows. I moved to a smaller place near the coast. Bought new glasses, cut my hair. People always talk about reinvention like it's a costume change, but it felt more like remembering who I was before he taught me how to doubt my instincts. Lucia and I met once in Lisbon, drank white wine, watched tourists take pictures in front of buildings built before either of us were born. She said I looked lighter. I said I finally exhaled. She smiled and said, he never thought either of us would survive him. I said I didn't survive him. I walked out early. And now, sometimes, when I pass couples holding hands in the street, I wonder what languages they've never spoken to each other. What clauses they've buried under sweetness. I don't reach for closure. I reach for continuity, for the version of myself that doesn't flinch when love asks for context. When Julian calls, because he still does sometimes, I let it ring. Not because I'm angry, but because there's nothing left to clarify. I heard everything. Every word he didn't say. Every one he said too clearly. And what I signed wasn't just a contract. It was an ending that knew itself.